What happens when a television show arrives just a little too early for the culture it's meant to entertain? And how often do we only recognize quiet revolutions once enough time has passed to make them feel inevitable? In hindsight, cultural change rarely announces itself with fanfare. It doesn't always march into the room waving flags or demanding attention. Sometimes, it slips in quietly, wrapped in humor, softened by familiar formats, disguised as something safe. That was My Two Dads. When the sitcom premiered in the late 1980s, it presented itself as harmless, even comforting. A gentle laugh track. A bright, open loft apartment. A teenage girl navigating adolescence while being raised by two men who genuinely cared about her well-being. On the surface, it felt like yet another network comedy meant to fill a half-hour time slot between more established hits. But underneath that polished exterior was something far more precarious. My Two Dads was a show walking a cultural tightrope, balancing progressive ideas against network anxiety, advertiser pressure, and a country still deeply uncomfortable with anything that challenged the traditional family structure. It was never just a sitcom. It was an experiment in how much change audiences might tolerate without realizing they were being challenged at all. And what most viewers never knew was how close that experiment came to collapsing before it even began. A cultural climate that wasn't ready, even if it pretended to be. To understand why My Two Dads was such a gamble, you have to understand the television landscape of the late 1980s. This was a period when family values were loudly defended in public discourse. The AIDS crisis had intensified fear and stigma around homosexuality. LGBTQ+ representation, when it existed at all, was often tragic, villainized, or relegated to single-episode, very special storylines. Sitcoms were expected to comfort, not confront. Television executives knew this. Networks were still haunted by past failures, shows that had pushed too far, too fast, and paid the price in ratings, protests, or advertiser withdrawals. The lesson executives took from those failures wasn't do better. It was be careful. So when My Two Dads was pitched, fear entered the room immediately. Two men raising a teenage girl together? Sharing domestic space? Making joint parenting decisions? Even without explicit romance, the implications alone were enough to make executives uneasy. What would audiences assume? What would conservative groups accuse? Which sponsors would quietly disappear after the pilot aired? The concern wasn't whether the story was good. It was whether the story was survivable. Reframing the premise. Progress with an escape hatch. From the very beginning, the show's creators understood that if My Two Dads was going to make it to air, it needed a safety net. That safety net came in the form of a carefully constructed premise. Michael Taylor and Joey Harris weren't just two men raising a child. They were both former lovers of the same woman, now deceased. Each had a plausible claim to being Nicole's biological father. Their shared parenting wasn't a philosophical statement. It was, at least on paper, a temporary solution to an unresolved problem. That framing mattered. It gave NBC executives something to point to when concerns arose. It allowed advertisers to rationalize their support. It reassured skeptical viewers that nothing radical was happening here. Every script leaned into that reassurance. Dialogue frequently reminded audiences of the men's heterosexual pasts. Female love interests appeared regularly. Emotional intimacy between Michael and Joey was carefully calibrated, present enough to feel real, restrained enough to avoid misinterpretation. But even with all those precautions, fear never fully left the production. Every episode was reviewed with caution. Every joke was weighed for risk. Every reaction from the audience was monitored. The show had to be funny. It had to be wholesome. And above all, it had to be non-threatening. The question no one dared ask out loud was simple. How honest can a story be when fear is sitting in the writer's room? The casting choice that nearly altered television history. Before the show ever found its footing, it nearly took a very different shape. Early on, Paul Reiser was seriously considered for the role of Michael Taylor, the structured, analytical financial advisor. At the time, Reiser was emerging as a smart, cerebral comedic voice, someone who could ground the show with dry wit and emotional intelligence. But Reiser hesitated. He understood the risk instinctively. Would audiences misinterpret the show? Would his involvement permanently brand him? Would future opportunities quietly disappear? His agent urged caution. Other projects beckoned. And eventually, Reiser stepped away. That decision forced producers to recalibrate. Greg Evigan was cast as Joey Harris, the more free-spirited, creative counterpart. Paul Reiser's absence shifted the balance of the duo, but it also opened space for something unexpected. What followed wasn't instant chemistry. Early rehearsals were awkward. Two actors from different comedic traditions, feeling the weight of scrutiny, unsure how far they could go. But off-camera conversations began to change things. Shared anxieties turned into mutual understanding. Professional respect turned into genuine camaraderie. That bond translated on screen. Audiences didn't just believe these men cared about Nicole, they believed they cared about each other. And that emotional truth, however carefully framed, became the foundation of the show's success. It raises an interesting question. Would my two dads have survived at all without that unspoken authenticity? A child at the center of the storm. If the adult casting determined the show's structure, the casting of Nicole determined its soul. The role required something rare. The character needed to feel emotionally complex without being precocious, vulnerable without being weak, funny without turning into a gimmick, and above all real. Hundreds of actresses auditioned. Most were competent. Few were convincing. Then Stacey Keenan walked into the room. She didn't perform the role. She inhabited it. Her reactions felt natural, her timing unforced. She didn't play Nicole as a TV kid. She played her as a human being navigating loss, uncertainty, and love. Still, NBC hesitated. Focus groups were assembled. Audience reactions were studied. Executives debated whether a child actor could anchor a show carrying so much subtext. When the feedback returned overwhelmingly positive, the network finally relented. What no one could measure at the time was how deeply Keenan's own life experiences mirrored Nicole's. Years later, she would acknowledge that the emotional weight she brought to the role wasn't entirely fictional. That authenticity radiated through the screen. And audiences responded, not because they were ready for unconventional families, but because they recognized emotional truth when they saw it. The loft that quietly argued for change. The apartment set of My Two Dads did more cultural work than most scripts ever could. Designed as an open loft, it avoided the visual language of traditional family homes. There were no separate bedrooms neatly divided by roles. Instead, the space was shared, fluid, and adaptable. Much like the family itself. Exposed brick suggested strength. Warm lighting suggested safety. Personal clutter suggested lived-in authenticity. Joey's artistic chaos clashed gently with Michael's order. Neither dominated the space. Both belonged. Without ever saying it aloud, the set whispered a radical idea. A family doesn't have to look traditional to feel like home. For viewers uneasy with the premise, that visual comfort mattered. It softened resistance. It normalized what might otherwise have felt strange. Sometimes, persuasion works best when it doesn't announce itself. A theme song that almost missed its moment. You Can Count on Me wasn't meant to be revolutionary. It was meant to be sincere. That nearly got it cut. NBC executives worried the theme was too soft, too emotional, not hooky enough. Alternative versions were tested. Upbeat, generic, forgettable. Producers pushed back. They argued that sincerity was the hook. That emotional grounding was the point. When audiences responded positively, the debate ended. The theme song became a promise. This show would treat its characters, and its viewers, with respect. How often does restraint age better than spectacle? When backlash becomes background noise. Opposition arrived quickly. Conservative organizations wrote letters. Sponsors were pressured. Certain affiliates refused to air episodes. NBC responded defensively, emphasizing again and again that the men were heterosexual, that the show upheld traditional values, that nothing subversive was happening. Writers were instructed to be careful. Affection between the men was limited. Romantic storylines with women were emphasized. Subtext was allowed, but only just The irony was impossible to miss. The show was accused of challenging norms precisely because it revealed how fragile those norms were. And yet, week after week, audiences tuned in. Optics over art. Casting as reassurance. The casting of Dick Butkus as Judge Wilbur's bailiff wasn't accidental. Butkus wasn't brought in for nuance. He was brought in for symbolism. A former NFL star. A symbol of traditional masculinity. A familiar face audiences trusted. His presence sent a message. Relax. This is still safe. It worked. But it also highlighted a truth about television. Sometimes decisions are made less for storytelling than for perception. The answer that cost the show its momentum. For 2 seasons, the question of Nicole's biological father fueled the series. It kept the men equal. It sustained tension. It gave emotional weight to every conflict. Then, in season 3, the mystery was resolved. Michael Taylor was revealed as the father. The result wasn't outrage. It was deflation. The balance disappeared. Joey's role diminished. The central tension evaporated. Ratings declined. It wasn't that viewers disliked the answer. It was that the question had been the engine. How many stories lose their power by rushing to closure? A writer's room divided against itself. Behind the scenes, My Two Dads was never unified. Some writers wanted to push boundaries. Others wanted to survive. Every episode reflected that struggle. One week, the show hinted at something braver. The next, it retreated into safety. Progress was made, then undone. Was the show revolutionary or cautious? The truth is, it was both. And that tension defined it. What did My Two Dads really accomplish? It didn't transform television overnight. It didn't openly challenge societal norms. It didn't shout its message. Instead, it normalized something unfamiliar. It let audiences laugh, empathize, and accept, often without realizing they were doing so. And sometimes, that's how real change happens. So the question isn't whether My Two Dads went far enough. The real question is this. How different would television and culture look today if it had been allowed to? When television trusted its audience, and when it didn't. There was a time when television trusted viewers with nuance. When discomfort wasn't immediately smoothed away. When stories were allowed to breathe. My Two Dads existed in the narrow space between those eras. It never fully belonged to its time. And it never fully escaped it. But decades later, its quiet courage feels louder than ever. And maybe that's the greatest irony of all. Sometimes the safest stories are the ones that take the biggest risks. And the ones we don't fully appreciate until the culture finally catches up. Quietly, insistently, the story of My Two Dads refuses to sleep. It lingers in small things, a wardrobe note tucked into a seam, a director's scribble on a blocking sheet, a fan letter folded into a shoebox, and in the way people remember one another long after a network has moved on. To expand that story is not to invent. It is to breathe the missing air into the rooms we already know, to linger on faces and conversations the cameras cut away from, and to ask the questions the show itself often hinted at but rarely shouted. What follows is an attempt to do exactly that. To enlarge, to deepen, to remain steady with the truth of the original while filling in the places where memory, rumor, and human complexity gather. When the first episode aired in 1987, My Two Dads seemed at once comfortable and awkward. The television equivalent of a family member showing up at Thanksgiving with a new, unusual partner. The premise was simple enough on paper. Two men, very different in temperament and background, are thrust into shared guardianship of a girl, Nicole Bradford, after her mother's sudden death. In a landscape dominated by nuclear families on repeat, the setup demanded a gentle recalibration from viewers. It asked them to accept that parental love did not arrive only inside a marriage certificate. That the adhesive of family could be honesty, effort, and the willingness to put someone else before yourself. For some audiences, the idea landed like a small surprise. For others, it stayed with them like a question that would not quiet. At the center of the show's heartbeat, not the headline names, not the sitcom beats, but the soft, human pulse, stood Judge Margaret W. Wilbur. When Florence Stanley first stepped into the judge's robe, she did something the script did not quite expect. She made the judge not solely an instrument of plot, but a person with a private logic. Margaret Wilbur became the one character who could, with a look and a single line, recalibrate an episode's moral center. She was not paradisiacal. She arrived with a history. In private, she smoked too many cigarettes and kept a shelf of battered legal texts that she would thumb through when she wanted to recall simpler days of black and white rulings. On screen, she cultivated an air of small mercies, a softening of the bench for those who needed it, a firm knock of the gavel for those who would not do the work. The writers gave her the occasional epigraph, "Courts settle law, people settle life." But it was Stanley's particular economy of expression that transformed those lines into something like gospel for the show. Her judge was the rare adult who did not confuse authority with distance. She could be commanding and tender in the same breath. That tenderness extended off-camera. Florence kept a list of lessons for young actors, not about blocking or inflection, but about how to hold presence in a chaotic set. She saw Stacy Keenan, the actress who played Nicole, as a raw filament of talent, someone who needed not only direction but supervision, guidance about the press, a model for managing sudden attention, and a steadying voice when high school felt more foreign than it should. "You will owe this business nothing," Florence would tell Stacy between takes. "It will ask everything, and you should decide what it's allowed to take." These lines, said quietly over coffee and makeup trailers, shaped Stacy's later decisions in ways she wouldn't name until years later. The decision to cancel My Two Dads in 1990 felt, to those on the inside, like a sort of erasure. It was not catastrophic in the way a show being axed for abysmal ratings might be. It was pragmatic, a network shifting its chess pieces. NBC was rearranging its Thursday night. The executive calendar was full of promises to advertisers, and shows that did not gleam with instantaneous, marketable heat were at risk. But the equation of business and art rarely accounts for the soft scaffolding that television builds around people's lives. For the cast and crew, the cancellation did not read as a strategic choice. It read like abandonment. Imagine the immediate aftermath. Scripts stacked in cardboard boxes, call sheets with names circled and crossed, the sudden loss of an entire schedule of work that had carved structure into family life. For Stacy, who had grown up under studio lights, it was stepwise desolation. She had become the sort of young woman who measured weekends by the rhythm of taping dates and table reads. Then one morning the taping dates evaporated. Her mother, practical, protective, urged her toward ordinary adolescence. And so Stacy went, to public school, to debate tournaments, to a life where her classmates did not know which parts of her were real and which belonged to someone else's scripts. She learned the radical pleasure of blending into the landscape. Paul Reiser felt the cancellation differently. He had arrived at My Two Dads with an energy that suggested he wanted to learn more than entertain. The show was, for him, an education in the complex ecosystem of television. In negotiations with networks, in the politics of casting, in the subtle alchemy of comedic timing with emotional truth. To him, the end of the series was not the end of a career but a pivot. He carried those lessons, the mastery of domestic comedy, the ability to spin authenticity out of small details, into the creation of Mad About You. There, he kept a firmer grip on creative control, refusing the compromises that had once diluted his intentions. What would have seemed like a quiet failure in 1990 revealed itself as a seedbed for future triumph. And yet triumph is not the only possible outcome of being seen. Greg Evigan, Joey Harris to those who loved him, discovered the more ambivalent side of visibility. The kind of warmth he projected on screen began to stick like a well-known face, a mask that casting directors could not easily remove. Typecasting is a slow, polite kind of imprisonment. Doors no longer opened because industry people assumed he was only one sort of man. The change in the entertainment zeitgeist did not help. As the 1990s moved toward grittier narratives and edgier protagonists, a wholesome image, once an asset, began to appear quaint. Evigan adjusted. He accepted supporting roles, found steadier work in theater and guest appearances, and in the margins, cultivated a life that didn't care as much about the leading man mantle. Some actors reinvent. Some accept a quieter dignity. Both choices are valid, and both have their own grief. One of the cruelest theatrical ironies of all was the fate of the loft itself, the physical stage on which so much of the show's intimacy played out. In the literal aftermath of the cancellation, the studio crews dismantled the set as if it were a stage prop from a closed tourist attraction. Walls came down. A furniture piece that had once gathered the family was sold to a set decorator who liked the vintage look. The physical environment that had held Nicole's bedroom, the kitchen where arguments and reconciliations unfolded, the quiet bench where the judge once offered an unexpected piece of wisdom, all of it recycled in the merciless economy of studio space. This practical disposability made fans furious in ways that confounded executives. How could something that felt so alive to so many be whisked away without ceremony? The answer is, in part, the shape of the industry itself. An institution allergic to sentiment when it collides with short-term balance sheets. But the erasure of the set also had the more human consequence of removing a tangible anchor for memory. People wanted relics to touch, tokens to confirm that those scenes had once mattered. The loss of the set made the surviving props, like Nicole's lamp, suddenly radioactive with significance. It is telling that one of the few artifacts to survive was so unassuming. Nicole's bedroom lamp was a cheap, slightly kitschy porcelain piece with a small crack on its base. For years it lay neglected in a garage, tossed among other discarded set items and forgotten production gear. When a collector found it decades later, authenticated its provenance, and placed it on an auction block, the price it fetched was more than a transaction, it was an argument. For more than $8,000, someone had purchased proof that the show existed, that it had touched people, that it had left a trace in the culture. The lamp's ascent into cultural cachet revealed how objects can be anchors for communal memory. In the absence of studio preservation, fans made their own shrines. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about My Two Dads is how it produced an unintentional legacy. The show never overtly addressed LGBTQ themes. The language of network television and advertisers in the late 1980s made certain conversations impossible. Yet for those who had learned to read between the lines, for young queer people and for anyone who had grown up in families that did not fit tidy templates, the series read like a map of recognition. Two men sharing custody. The focus on commitment over conventional romance. The tacit lesson that family could be formed by care rather than a certificate. In the subtlety of its depiction, the show offered a lesson that would blossom overtly in later decades, when television could speak more plainly. Had networks been braver, the series might have named what it already embodied. But representation often arrives ahead of language. People find themselves reflected in art even when the show refuses to speak. This dissonance, between what My Two Dads showed and what it permitted itself to say, is the field where much of its power lay. It pushed, in faint ways, against the limits of its era. It suggested that domestic comedy could accommodate different family architectures. It suggested that tenderness and masculinity could coexist without explanation. These were not radical prescriptions so much as quiet demonstrations. If a show could imagine a family outside the usual frame and permit affection to flourish, perhaps audiences could learn to do the same. The creative team behind the show deserves some of the credit for these tentatively subversive moves. Writers and producers, many of them young, eager, and curious, tamped down panic about controversy and instead focused on the core human questions. They asked, what does it look like to teach a child to be brave? How do two men with different temperaments negotiate bedtime? What happens when one of the dads wants to date and the other must reassess boundaries? These are small, practical questions, but they are also the questions that recalibrate public imagination over time. To imagine novel domestic scenarios is to expand the available futures audiences can see for themselves. And then there are the backstage friendships that grew out of the show's particular chemistry. The reunion years later of Paul Reiser and Greg Evigan at a nostalgia event was less a press-friendly staged photo than a private reclamation of shared rhythms. When they walked on stage, neither was the same person they had been in 1987. Life had done its soft and brutal shaping. Marriages, children, careers pivoting in and out of the limelight. Yet the timing, the small pauses and embedded jokes that relied on minute of glance, returned like muscle memory. They laughed in the way of people who've weathered a storm together. Afterwards they found each other in the city and began meeting for dinner with less fanfare and more curiosity. Those dinners, often in neighborhoods far from the Hollywood machine, were not career strategy sessions. They were human check-ins, confessions, and mutual support. Those friendships, perhaps more than syndication checks or critical reappraisals, are My Two Dads' most durable product. It's easy to read the arc of the show as a series of losses. Cancellation without closure, a set dismantled, actors typecast or forced to recalibrate careers. But there is a second reading, one in which failure is also a kind of instruction. Paul Reiser's next show achieved what few predicted. Stacy Keenan found a way back on her own terms, more mature and more guarded. Florence Stanley became a lodestar for generations of actresses who noticed how she navigated the trade-off between authority and warmth. And the fans, fiercely loyal, remarkably discriminating, continued to carry the show in letter-writing campaigns, in fan clubs, and in the small ways people mark the artifacts of their childhoods. Television history is an ecology. Some species thrive and colonize the cultural landscape. Others vanish, leaving behind only traces. But traces have their own kind of power. They teach historians, and more importantly, audiences, to look closer. To ask questions. Why was the show cancelled at 60 episodes and not given a farewell? Was the decision purely fiscal, or was there a quiet discomfort at networks about what the show represented? How many other series arrived early with an idea the culture was not yet prepared to accept? As the 1990s matured, other shows took up the same questions My Two Dads had tentatively raised and pushed them further into the center of popular conversation. Modern Family, which premiered more than 2 decades later, could not have existed in quite the same form without predecessors that demonstrated the comedic possibilities of domestic variety. Even programs that never directly alluded to My Two Dads learned from its small experiment. Audiences were not as brittle as programming executives sometimes presumed. They could hold complexity. They could accept ambiguous, evolving households. Television's arc over the decades suggests that change often comes not through dramatic revolutions but through accretion. Small shows, whispered ideas, characters who refuse to be easily dismissed. Isn't that how cultural change often works? Not as a single heroic conquest, but as a long, quiet accumulation of practices, images, and mercies? The lamp's auction price was less about porcelain than about narrative claim. Fans wanted to say, definitively, that they had not made this up. They wanted the physical proof that their memories were not private hallucinations. The show's subtle LGBTQ legacy, its unspoken but visible family model, functioned the same way. It provided, for those craving representation, a mirror whose edges were imperfect but whose reflection was nonetheless recognizable. There is also something to be said about what the show teaches us now about grief and repair. Television's economy rewards novelty and market clarity. It rarely reveres the slow work of reconfiguration. Yet life, messy, non-televised life, proceeds in fits and starts. For the actors, especially the youngest among them, the show's end required painful recalibration. They learned to fold their identities in new ways, to accept summers that no longer felt infinite. For audiences, the lack of a definitive farewell required their own rituals of closure. Fan fiction, screen captures preserved in private folders, the lamp that proved the show existed. These acts of memory are not lesser than official endings. They are, in some cases, more honest. They are how people make sense of absence. A final thought. The story of My Two Dads is not only about a show or its cancellation. It is about the way art makes rooms for people who have been systematically undercounted by culture. It is about the small bets that creators make, sometimes tentatively, sometimes accidentally, on what we can accept and love. It is about mentorship, about actors who pass along the unglamorous wisdom of staying human in a dehumanizing industry. It is about how artifacts, even a cracked lamp, contain the power to reanimate memory. So we return to the questions the show itself left hanging. How many programs arrive too early? How many ideas are dismissed because they discomfort an industry more than an audience? And in your life, what small thing might be quietly building the future you cannot yet fully see? Sometimes a lamp is just a lamp. Sometimes it is an argument about what we are allowed to remember. Sometimes a canceled show is a lesson in disguise. A lesson for creators, for industry gatekeepers, and for audiences who keep the stories alive in their own hands. In the end, perhaps that is what matters most. That even when the set is dismantled and the gavel put away, the human work continues, repaired by dinners between friends, by choices about which roles to accept, and by the fans who refuse to let a small, awkward show vanish entirely. And so the story keeps being told, in auctions and interviews and the quiet, stubborn ways people remember one another. It keeps asking us those same patient questions. If it arrived too soon once, how many more times will we miss the future because we were not ready to listen?